Yes.
It's the gallery view.
Okay, so
You want to
give
see
me
everybody?
I don't care if I see them.
Okay, there you go. You guys see everybody? Or to active speaker?
Active speak.
Wait, I'm
all
sorry.
right, so I'm going to mute everybody. And I know you're getting to be pros at this point, but you can unmute yourself whenever you want to, and you just hold down your space bar in order to do that. Alternatively, if you want to, at any point, raise your hand. You can do that by just hovering over your name in the participant screen, and I will also pause intermittently for questions. So we are continuing, and we're actually nearing the end of our Inequality Rising lecture series. And as you probably recollect, but as I'm going to refresh your memory on, we had discussed together last week some literature from the field of public health, in particular, the work by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, two books, Spirit Level and Inner Level, that demonstrate, I think, quite powerfully that more unequal societies are, generally speaking, less healthy societies. And that's true in terms of life expectancy. It's true in terms of infant mortality. It's true in terms of heart disease. It's true in terms of obesity or mental health. It's also true that more unequal societies have less trust, less cooperation, more difficulty getting things done politically. And although Wilkinson and Pickett are epidemiologists, I believe their analysis helps us to understand why that is the case as well. And so this was, in a sense, the culmination of our long study of how inequality works, the fact that it's growing, the fact that there have been significant economic changes in the United States in the last 50 years that have produced a much wider gap in both income and wealth. The fact that that gap often coincides with differences in race and gender as well. Some of the explanations for the forces that generated the greater departure in income and wealth over the last 50 years. And we talked a lot about changes in the economy, the move from an industrial manufacturing into a service and information economy, the spread of automation technology, the increasing global wage competition. And I don't mean to be inundating you with information. I'm just refreshing your memory about the long journey that we've taken together in thinking about inequality. And I'm recognizing that it's been nearly 2 months now that we've been talking about this together. It's a nice, sustained opportunity we've had for a good conversation. We then talked about a narrowly economic perspective to understand what's going on in terms of the trends in globalization and the way in which especially the Chinese have seen incredible economic growth and mobility over the last 50 years, as has the global elite. The richest 1% in the world have seen vast increases in their wealth, but that the middle class of the rich societies have not seen much benefit at all from globalization. As a matter of fact, their economic position has been quite stagnant for the last 50 years, and the quality of their work has in fact gone down dramatically. They no longer have good, stable jobs with benefits that allow for a middle-class life and economic mobility. More and more often, they are in temporary, precarious work, unable to pay all their bills, seeing not only downward economic mobility, but also an erosion of their status in our society. And we began to spread out our perspective from a narrowly economic perspective into a broader sociological and psychological perspective by looking at the work of Angus Deaton and Anne Case on deaths of despair, and noticing that it's especially the white working class in America that has seen increases in suicides, drug addiction and drug-related deaths, alcoholism and alcohol-related deaths. And that is because they precisely expected that their social standing and economic mobility was secure, and it turned out not to be at all secure. We looked sociologically at the idea that in any dynamic economy, there are important underlying forces that will generate inequality unless there are adaptive policy responses every time inequality rises. And so one of the ways to explain what's happened in the last 50 years is that our policy has not kept up with the changes occurring in our economy and society, and that this has generated a profound sense of not only economic insecurity, but also social status anxiety on the part of the white working class. And I showed you some data to suggest this may be part of the explanation for how Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016. Finally, and most recently, we did look at this public health perspective. And here I want to spend a few minutes really reviewing what we learned by looking not only at Case and Deaton, but primarily at Wilkinson and Pickett's work. And I thought I had a slide there. Let me just get the books to refresh your memory. We have their earlier book, The Spirit Level, and their newer book, The Inner Level. Both of these by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, two leading public health researchers in Britain. And their argument, I think, is summarized by these two diagrams I'm about to show you. The first diagram shows that if you take a composite index of health and social problems, including life expectancy, math and literacy rates for kids graduating from high school, infant mortality, homicide rates, imprisonment rates, teenage births, the overall level of social trust, obesity, mental illness, and social mobility. You bundle all of that together into an index of overall social well-being, and what you see is a very strong correlation, which is the more unequal a society gets, and that's being measured on this bottom axis, from low inequality, where Japan, Sweden, Norway, Finland are the least unequal of the developed societies, societies with $20,000 a year per person of income or more. The US, Portugal, Britain are the most unequal societies, right? And if you then correlate their inequality with their overall score of health and social problems, what you see is that the least unequal societies are also the healthiest. And conversely, the most unequal societies are the unhealthiest. And so that's their jumping off point. And then they look at this between the relationship between health and wealth, right? Not inequality, but wealth. And what they find is that there is no real relationship, right? Portugal, which is very unequal, but not very wealthy, and the US, which is very wealthy, but also very unequal, have similar scores in terms of overall social health. Whereas the societies that are more equal, it doesn't matter how wealthy they are, they still score well in terms of social health. I'm not going to review the entire data set with you, but I do want you to see some of the representative metrics for measuring this. So you can look at child well-being, right? And see again, the more equal the society is, the higher its score in terms of child well-being. The less equal the society is, the worse its score is in terms of child well-being. If we look at this in terms of wealth, what we see is there's no correlation between a society being richer and its children doing better. The correlation is exclusively with how equal or unequal the society is. If we look at this in terms of the level of trust in the society, we see the same relationship: more equal, more trust; less equal, less trust. And we talked about this a little bit last week. That's in part because there's greater social distance between people in a more unequal society. When people are more unequal, their circumstances differ more from each other on average, their experience doesn't generalize to each other as well. If I live in Scarsdale and you live in Harlem, in a sense, we're living in profoundly different worlds. And so on what basis are we going to develop social trust? It's not going to be a given. It's going to have to be earned. And that's what happens in more unequal societies. Similarly, this holds across states in the United States. More equal states have higher levels of trust, less equal states have lower levels of trust. And it also holds for social mobility. The more equal the society is, the easier it is for people to move up the social ladder. When the society is more unequal, it gets harder. And that's not just because the rungs on the ladder are further apart, because it's harder to climb when the distance is further. It's also because the people already at the top are scared of falling, because in their society, in a more unequal society, to fall is to fall far. And they do more than to keep the people beneath them down in order to preserve their own position. That's, I think, a quite robust finding in the sociology of inequality. We talked about this diagram, right? One way to understand this is that you may have the same divisions into classes or strata or social groups in a more unequal society, like the tall pyramid on the left, and a more equal society, the squat pyramid on the right. But the distance between the strata, the difference between the different groups, is less when the society is more unequal, when the inequality is compressed. And it's greater in the more unequal society. And that's generating a lot of the stress, what Wilkinson and Pickett call social evaluative stress. When the people in the tall pyramid are looking down at the next level below them, they're looking down from further up. It matters more. When they're compressed together, the groups don't have as much to differentiate them, and you're not looking up or looking down as far. And so the idea that the people above you are evaluating you as being below them is more stressful in the more unequal society, less stressful in the more equal society. That's one of the fundamental mechanisms at work here. So to conclude the review of Wilkinson and Pickett, I want to share a quote with you that I didn't share last week. And this is from the newer book, the book on the inner level, which was published just last year. The subtitle of the book, How More Equal Societies Reduce Stress, Restore Sanity, and Improve Everyone's Well-Being. And the quote from pages 25 to 26, the more hierarchical a society is, the stronger the idea that people are ranked according to inherent differences of worth or value, and the greater their insecurities about self-worth. Irrespective of individual differences in skills and abilities, in such countries, people's social position is taken even more as indicating their worth as superior or inferior. Inevitably, this exacerbates social evaluative threat and people's status anxieties. Social comparisons become more fraught, increasing insecurity and self-worth. Everything from physical attractiveness and intelligence to leisure activities, skin color, aesthetic taste, and consumer spending take on greater social meaning in terms of rank and worth, right? And so I hope this is clear. But in a more unequal society, we have to care more about relative status differences and the way in which they are marked by the neighborhood we live in, the clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the schools we send our kids to, the kind of work that we have, right? And so we're constantly comparing ourselves with others in all of those respects to determine our relative standing or worth. And that's hard. That actually produces stress hormones in the body. It makes the body and the brain believe that you are in dominant subordination relationships, and we are deeply programmed to be stressed about those relationships because those relationships, historically speaking, whether we're talking about the history of the human species or its prehistory in primate species, those relations of dominance and subordination are dangerous for us, and we need to be attuned to them and stressed by them. And so that is what's happening in more unequal societies. That is the underlying mechanism that explains all the respects in which they are less healthy societies. And I wanted to conclude this part of the discussion by noting this quite, I think, solid generalization in the sociology of inequality. As scarcity increases, competition increases. And I think in the last 50 years, we've had a scarcity of good jobs, a scarcity of well-paid jobs, a scarcity of income as well. And as a result, the competition to get those good jobs has gone up. And as a result, when we live in a more competitive society, we do less to cooperate. We tend to generate greater scarcity. And then we have one of those cycles that reinforces the inequality that we started with. All right. And so when we think then about the more specific mechanisms generating the kinds of stress and pathological behavior that Wilkinson and Pickett are documenting, I want to emphasize 5 of them. They're not completely independent, they're related to each other. The first is what I've called relative social distance. And again, you can think of Scarsdale and Harlem, or you can think of somebody, you don't have to go that far, right? Upper East Side as opposed to East Harlem. You've got people who might live a few blocks away from each other, but nevertheless, their life experiences are fundamentally different in terms of the kinds of schools that the children go to, in terms of the attitude the police takes when it polices the neighborhood, in terms of the quality of housing or the relative square footage that people tend to live in, right? And so as we become more and more different from each other because we're more unequal and we use the inequality in resources to afford different ways of life, we become more different from each other. As we become more different from each other, it becomes harder to empathize with and understand the situation of others within your own society. And so as a result, our cooperation, our trust, and our reciprocity decline, right? We just are not as inclined to give the benefit of the doubt or to lend a hand or to think that this is the kind of person who I should be figuring out how we can work together to solve our shared problems, as opposed to, this is the kind of person I need to protect myself from. And that goes both ways, right? The poor need to protect themselves from the rich need to protect themselves from the poor in a more unequal society, in part just because their situations are so different from each other. All right, a second big mechanism. Again, I've discussed this a little already, and this goes back to the work that I've mentioned to you on a few different occasions. Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. He's the one who did the path-breaking research on this. And the idea is that in a society in which you believe people are looking at you in order to stereotype you, right? So they're looking at the way you dress, or the way your teeth look, or the kind of car that you drive, in order to figure out where you fit in the social hierarchy. When you know people are looking at you that way, you tend to be more self-conscious. And the stereotype that people have might get inside you. Is somebody trying to ask a question at this point? No, okay, I heard a little noise in the background, but that's not a problem. So we've got social evaluative threat, and what we know is that when social evaluative threat is higher, cortisol production and the production of other destructive enzymes and hormones in the body goes up, and it goes up into levels that tend to indicate actual physical threat. And so it appears, based on what we understand about the way in which the brain and the body works, that when we have social evaluative threat, when we're worried that somebody is looking at us critically and about to stereotype us, it feels as if there's a lion stalking us. Not literally, that's what we think, but the body reacts in the same way. And that's tremendously unhealthy. And it results not only in, say, increased heart disease, but also in an increased propensity to bully or act with hostility or fear to others. All right, third mechanism, and I talked about this when we were looking at that pyramid a little bit, which is that if the rungs on the ladder are farther apart because your society is more unequal, the people who are above do their best to keep the people who are below down. And they do that for two reasons. First of all, it allows them to pass their privilege along and maintain it. It allows them to stay at their relatively privileged position. And second of all, in a more unequal society, it turns out more and more of our self-esteem, of our ability to think well of ourselves, turns on our ability to think that we are better than others. And so this is sometimes called the bicycling reaction, that we push down in order to get ahead, that we differentiate ourselves from those people who obviously are not as well educated or as well mannered or as deserving as we are. Fourth mechanism that seems to be at work in explaining why it is that more unequal societies are also less healthy societies. And this is a fundamental distinction in self-esteem that psychology really has just developed the tools to study and understand over the last 50 years. I would point out to you that Jean-Jacques Rousseau figured this out 250 years ago, and his distinction between normal and inflamed amour-propre. And amour-propre in French means self-love or pride. And the basic distinction here is between actually taking some pride, getting some esteem, the term Rousseau liked was self-love, based on the things you actually do and are good at, right? So if I'm good at teaching you guys and I take a certain amount of pride in that, that's justified and that's fine. And in part, it's tied to something good that I'm doing for other people if I'm doing it well, right? And similarly, if you play the violin well and your friends enjoy hearing your recitals, or if you are a good bridge partner and people like playing with you, right? Those are things that you really are good at and you can take some pride in, and there's nothing wrong with it. As a matter of fact, the fact that we take pride in doing things that we do well, especially well, leads us to actually do them even better, to invest energy in improving ourselves, including in ways that benefit other people, right? So that's not a bad thing. But insecure self-esteem is the kind of self-esteem that you get from puffing yourself up, even if you're not particularly good at something, or by purchasing something in order to make you feel special instead of developing one of your own qualities in ways that benefit other people, right? And so if you drive a swanky car, or if you own a really expensive suit or dress, you might feel good and special in that suit or dress, and that's not the worst thing in the world. But if you're doing it because you feel insecure at a deeper level, and if in fact your society makes most people feel insecure, and then they find ways to prop themselves up, not by making themselves better or developing their own skills and doing things that help other people, but just by purchasing markers of status, then you're in a society with insecure self-esteem. And I'll give you a simple illustration. When you surveyed high school students in the 1940s and 1950s, and you asked them, do you think you're special? Do you think you're important? Only about 10% of the students answered yes. Today, when you give that same survey, 80% of students say they're special or important. And you know, you don't want to blame somebody for thinking they're special, but there's something else going on that explains that incredible shift from 10% to 80%. And the psychologists who study this suggest it is the prevalence of insecure self-esteem and then the need to find ways to compensate. Final thing I'll just remind you of, and we talked about this, is that in a more equal society, people think of themselves as equal, and they demand laws and policies that treat them as equal and maintain their equality. But once a society gets to be sufficiently unequal, people begin to think of themselves as different and to want to do things to preserve their current advantage. And so that both equality and inequality can be self-reinforcing or cyclical. And that part of what we're seeing as we've become a more unequal society over the last 50 years is that there are a lot of behaviors that are designed to preserve or promote or emphasize inequality. So let me now just share with you a few concluding implications of this analysis. One of them has to do with stress and risk of death. And this goes back to Wilkinson's early research. And what he found looking at British civil servants is that the people who had the lowest levels of work-related stress also had lesser levels of mortality or risk of death. And in particular, the big factor was heart disease. And as the level of work-related stress went up, and please note that they're actually using both psychological metrics, how much control do you have over your own work? How much security do you have that your job will be there next year and the year after that? But also physiological markers, hormones that measure stress by doing blood tests. And as the stress level went up, so too did the risk of death. And as you can see, the people who were in the highest stress positions, generally speaking, lowest down the pecking order in the British civil servants, also had risks of death that were twice as high as their superiors who did not feel that much stress at work. And so the stress that we're generating for ourselves and each other because we live in a more unequal society is demonstrably unhealthy. So this is about status anxiety in particular, right? And what we see is, and this is comparing high inequality, medium inequality, and low inequality societies, right? So the top line is the high inequality, the middle line, the medium inequality, the dark line, low inequality. And then we're looking at the bottom of society and the top of society. And again, I want you to notice that at the bottom of society, in a high inequality, a medium inequality, or a low inequality society, everyone experiences more stress than at the top of society. But please note that the people in high inequality societies at the bottom of society are experiencing much more status anxiety. And as we go up into the middle ranges, the middle class, people are experiencing less stress, but still substantially more stress in high inequality than low inequality societies. And please note that this continues all the way to the top of society. You might think that the people in a high inequality society who have all the wealth, well, why should they feel any status anxiety? They're so much richer. But it turns out that they actually feel more stress than do the people in medium or low income societies, almost as much more as do the people at the bottom of the income ladder. And that is because a high inequality society makes everyone more self-conscious about their relative standing, not just the least well off. So this is what's called self-enhancement bias. This is what I was talking about a few minutes ago, where if we ask high school students, are you special and important, used to be a very small portion said no, or said yes, I'm sorry. Now most of them say yes. We call that self-enhancement bias, among other things, right? And we even see it when we ask people, how did you do on that test? It used to be people were more accurate in estimating how they did on tests. Now, people tend to say, oh, I did really well, even if they didn't do very well at all, in part because they're puffing themselves up, right? And so again, what we see here is that in more unequal societies, there's more self-enhancement bias, right? And given everything I've said to you, that shouldn't be surprising at this point. And finally, when we look at narcissism scores, right? How much do you care exclusively about yourself, right? One of the things we see is that precisely in lockstep, as inequality has gone up, so have narcissism scores gone up among college students in the United States. And again, we shouldn't be surprised. This is part of that syndrome in which fragile self-esteem leads to self-enhancement bias, leads to thinking more about yourself than thinking about other people. And so just because this is awfully somber stuff, I thought I'd conclude with a little joke, this cartoon. It's a great party. Everyone here is more insecure than I am. In a sense, that's what's happening in unequal societies, is we're all getting more insecure. And in a sense, we're in a competition to see who can render whom more insecure. All right, so that was my effort to really synthesize everything we've covered so far together in this course. And I'm about to transition into another perspective, which is a more philosophical perspective. But before I do that, let me stop and see what questions, comments, thoughts, concerns you might have. So I'm about to unmute everyone. You may still have to unmute yourself, but I think you should be able to ask questions at this point. Who wants to start us out? Anne, are you talking? I can't hear you, Anne. Hold on. And Stanley, I see you have your hand raised. Anne, I can't hear you. I think you may have to push your space bar. There you go. I think I can hear you now, Anne. No, I still can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Hey.
Anne, I am so sorry. Could you maybe chat the comment? Type the comment. Oh, you are? Let's see. Anne, can you try to type the comment instead? And Stanley, you've got your hand up. Is that right?
Yes.
So go ahead, Stanley. Anne, we'll try to get back to you. I'm sorry it's not working.
It seems to me in a previous talk, you explained that one of the reasons for the great inequality is that labor is worth less than investment, and then investment is growing faster. But it seems to me that this is only going to continue to get worse and worse over time. The things that are making labor, devaluating labor, are only going to continue, which is I think primarily automation. I mean the foreign, the exporting of jobs is only going to go so far, and then it's going to even out. But how are we going to fix it? That because labor is always going to be worth less.
Yeah. And I'm hearing a theme in your question, Stanley. How are we going to fix it? But let's start with the underlying comment, which is that one way to put this is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? Or to be more precise and economic about it, that those who own capital tend to do better than those who only own their labor and their skills and try to sell it to those who own capital, right? That and please note that Thomas Piketty has written now 2 of the best-selling books in economics in the last quarter century, demonstrating this using complex mathematics, but also an awful lot of data that goes back hundreds of years. And so you may remember, because you're referring back to my older lectures, that I also lectured on Branko Milanovic. And Milanovic, if you remember, believes in cycles, that as inequality goes up, it actually triggers things. You know, it could be wars, or it could be better education, it could be longer life expectancy and a need to invest more in social services as a result. But so those who believe that right now more of the wealth that our society is generating is going to those who own capital and less to those who work or draw wages. They're absolutely right. The data is very clear. The so-called labor share of workers has gone down substantially. That is to say, the amount that our society pays out for in wealth, in wages, right? That has gone down substantially over the last 50 years. And at the same time, the amount that people who earn by investing has gone up substantially. So you're absolutely right about the empirics here. The question is, does that just continue forever? That's Piketty's view. Or is that unsustainable? That's Milanovich's view. And I'm not sure who is right. You know, we've got two people who are in the short list for getting a Nobel Prize in economics who don't see eye to eye, right? That's not surprising. That's the nature of the discipline. But be that as it may, it does leave a question. They both agree in the short term that people who invest for a living are doing better than people who work for a living, and they continue to do better and better, right? The question is, does that go on forever or not? But the other question is, what can we do about it? And I will be very brief about this. There seem to be 2 or 3 big things that societies have done in the past to counteract this. One of them is to tax, right? To tax those who make their living from investing capital. We could do that in terms of capital gains taxes, right? We could do that in terms of corporate taxation. We can do that in terms of income taxation. We can do that in terms of wealth taxation, which has never been tried in this country, but is successfully implemented in several European societies. We could do it in terms of a value-added tax, which is essentially a national sales tax. Again, never tried in this country, but done very successfully in other societies. All that to say, there are a bunch of different tools in the taxation toolkit. And in a week or two, I'm going to start talking with you in more detail about these tools and how they work. So there's my promissory note, but that's just one avenue. Another avenue is to strengthen labor by strengthening unions, right? And again, there's a long history of legislation that has succeeded in doing that. And it's both pro-unionization, make it easier to form a union, and pro-union labor negotiation stances, right? So have judges, have courts, have bureaucrats who moderate or arbitrate labor disputes and have them play the role of equalizing the power between the two sides, which will increase wages, which will decrease profits, right? So that's a second major policy tool that's available to us. Then there are still other policy tools, right? Increasing access to education, for instance. And so all of that to say, there's no shortage of things to be done here. The question is, do we have the will? Do we have the resolve to do it? And I'm going to get back to lecturing with you, talking with you about what's happening in American politics pretty soon. And I do think there's something very interesting happening. I don't think it's exclusively about race. I think in many respects, many Americans are becoming more focused on inequality in general, are becoming a little bit more liberal, a little bit more progressive than we used to be. And so ideas that sounded really good on paper, but seemed to have a snowflake's chance in hell of passing 20 years ago, may have better prospects of success in 2020 in America. We'll have to see. November's only a few months away. We'll know better after the elections whether the country will be on a somewhat different course beginning next year. Thank you for the good question, Stanley. And I have given you an IOU. I will talk about these policies in more detail soon. Okay. All right, and can we try again? Hold on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yay.
I was going to say that the marches now have double value. Not only is it for Black Lives Matter, but it also shows the inequality that there is in the country. So I am very much pro-marching, whereas I am not against the force that they show, the police show or that, but I think it's pointing out to America that there is a lot of inequality, because a lot of the marchers, besides marching for Black Lives Matter, also point out that their lives are miserable.
Good point, Ann. And one of the things I should have mentioned when we did our, summary, this is what we've done together over the last 8 weeks. We obviously took a detour to talk about Black Lives Matter and racial inequality and inequality in the criminal justice system in the United States. And I am completely in agreement with you, which is to say that these are solidarity marches. These are marches in which people say, we are here for you because you have been subject to disproportionate police use of force, violence, including lethal violence. But in certain respects, we're also here with you, right? Because our situation is not what we want it to be. And we are angry at a political system that is non-responsive. It's non-responsive to African Americans who are demanding equal justice and some protection against disproportionate violence from the police. But it's also unresponsive to students who are saying, we're crippled with debt that we're getting in order to get an education that's supposed to be good not only for us, but for our society. Where can we get some relief? With workers who are saying, we're in the middle of a pandemic and we aren't able to pay our rent, and we're worried that eviction is coming, right? That there are multiple grievances. And I think in a sense, we may have reached, who knows, I don't have evidence for this, I'm hopeful, a bit of a tipping point in American politics, in which people say, to quote the line from the old movie, we're mad as hell and we're not gonna take it anymore, right? That in a sense seems to be—
I think that this has pointed out, because if you're gonna wait for legislators to debate all this, it's gonna take years. But this is like a punch to them.
Yeah, good. And we'll have to see if it translates into an actual electoral change in November, in which case it's been well worth it to have these protests. Let's hope that it doesn't result in a new outbreak of the virus or rapid transmission. We just don't know enough to know whether it's also contributing to that. All right, any other questions, or should I continue on with the—
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Harriet. I'll go. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I came late, but my basic thought is there is inequality in people, and they're always— I don't know if I missed this point, but people are basically unequal, even if you take the group that's sitting here. So we are always going to have, in my view, inequality in society, unless you're going to give everybody the same amount of money, no matter what their capabilities or ability to earn it is. That's one concern I have. The other one is that we live in a global society, and I've read that wonderful global inequality book that you recommended. And the point of that book is that you came to the African countries and those countries that are so far at the other side of equality, ability to get equal, that you couldn't possibly, unless you're pie in the sky, there's never going to be global equality in the world society. And without that, we're going to have wars and everything else that goes on. So I don't know if you covered this or not, but
No, I haven't covered it yet, Lois. And in a sense, you're asking me to cover something I was about to get to. So that's good. But let me just take those 2 points in turn very quickly. There's I think it's is it a Saul Bellow short story? It is about a society in which when you find someone who's really smart in school, you put a hearing aid in their ear to make a buzzing sound to distract them so that they don't get the advantage that comes with being really smart. So they're leveled down to the same level as everybody else, right? Nobody's talking about that, right? Obviously, we are of different heights and statures, different levels of physical fitness, different levels of different kinds of intelligence. Some of us are better at math, others of us are better at literature, others of us have high emotional intelligence, right? And that's human diversity. And nobody wants there to be less human diversity. We're more interesting and complementary. We do things for each other in part because we each have different skills, attributes, qualities that render us useful to each other. The issue is not making us the same in all ways. The issue is there a level of inequality that is morally objectionable and socially unhealthy, right? And so taking now more narrowly income. Again, I don't think anybody thinks that everybody should have the same income or that somebody earning 20 or 30 times the average is a disaster. I think people begin to get concerned when a group of people is earning 2 or 3 or 400 times the average income, and that wealth allows them to set themselves up as a group apart and allows them to have disproportionate political and cultural influence in your society, and in so doing set up policies and institutions that keep them on top and everybody else out, right? And so the question is not, do we equalize everyone? The question is, can we limit or bound inequality to the point where it doesn't become obviously unjust and unhealthy? That's the big question as far as I'm concerned. That's the question we're about to get to in terms of the philosophy issues. Your other question has to do with global inequality. And you're referring to the Blanco Milanovic book of that title. And the question about whether or not, well, what we've seen over the last 50 years is in part that Asia, especially China, but also India and Indonesia and Bangladesh got integrated into the global economy, right? And they have billions of people who were living on very little money. And so if you offered them $10 a day, they were very happy to work 12-hour days. And in many of those societies, it turns out you have a quite disciplined and compliant workforce who maybe work better than American workers. If by better we mean they just do what they're told and they do it reasonably well. And by the way, you're absolutely right. There are hundreds of millions or billions of workers in Africa and Central America who have not been integrated into the global economy yet in the way that the Chinese and the Indonesians and the Indians increasingly are. And so it may be that the next wave of globalization will be expanding into those reserves of untapped, very cheap labor. And so that this trend that we've witnessed for the last 50 years will go on for another 50 or 100 years. And by the way, as I've remarked, if you're a global cosmopolitan, if you care not just about people in your own country, but people who are suffering anywhere in the world, this is not altogether a bad thing. You have to be worried about the ways in which workers are treated, but when they go from living on $1 a day to living on $10 a day, they're doing better, right? And we should be happy for them. The question is, can we envision a world in which more wealth is created and distributed in the undeveloped parts of the world without the developed world becoming poorer and more unequal? And again, this goes back, right, to the question Stanley was asking a few minutes ago. What do we do, right? And I think that that's very important to address. In answering Stanley's question, I pointed to all these ways we could tax to diminish the exorbitant wealth of the very wealthy. If we were to do that, the result might be that our state has more money to spend on improving the situation of those who are not currently doing well in the developed world. And again, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but there are proposals for what they call universal basic income, which would be that we actually give minimum income to every person every month of every year, simply for being a citizen, for being a part of our society. And if work really is disappearing, right? And one of the more popular books in economics right now, Daniel Susskind of Oxford University has written this book called A World Without Work. If we're headed in that direction, we need to be thinking about what it is we can do to put ourselves in a place where those who aren't working are able to nevertheless be full, equal, cooperating members of our society. That doesn't mean they have the same income as those who are CEOs, obviously, but at least they're not deprived. At least they're not vulnerable. At least they're not clearly marked as being in a different caste or status group. So that's just a little bit. Yeah, that was a good question, Lois. Thank you. Does anybody else have a comment? We're basically running out of time. So I think as opposed to starting a new topic, if there's anything else you want to discuss, that's probably the best way to end today's class.
Well, I have a comment to make on the continent of Africa. All the countries in Africa are not equal. Their dictatorships, their brutality there, and we cannot interfere there. We cannot do anything about it. So it's a laissez-faire.
Yeah, so I'm not entirely convinced that we can't do anything about it. I certainly agree with you if what you mean is we don't want to invade. We you know, that it's not our problem to solve. And frankly, for the most part, it's not very constructive, right? You know, we intervened in Libya and Northern Africa, and it's still a civil war there a decade later, right? And so be careful that you don't unleash forces that you can't control without a kind of commitment and military force that we as a society seem unwilling to make at this moment in our history. So we're not going to remake these societies, right. But that doesn't mean we can't offer incentives and interventions that stop short of military power, that encourage indigenous democratization, the people themselves to take better control of their power. And this is a totally different topic.
Different topic.
Lecture series.
Lois brought it up, that's why I said.
Yeah, but again, I do think there are tools in our arsenal that we could be using if we're really interested in democracy promotion that stop short of military intervention, but are still accomplish. All right, anybody else with a question for today?
I just want to make another comment if nobody else does. But
Go ahead, Lois.
my basic thought as I read all this stuff is what kind of world, what kind of peaceful world are we able to create with all that we're talking about? I have trouble figuring out how the world could live at peace by doing whatever we're doing. And so I keep going back to throwing out all these things.
Yeah, so again, a huge question. Let me just point out that there's a inverse relationship between economic integration and political conflict. As societies trade more and more, and in particular, as our industries become highly interconnected, capitalists, people who have a lot of money and a lot of power, don't want war, right? Because it interferes with their ability to produce the goods they produce and sell, and hence to make profit. And so, in a sense, one issue is, could we, in fact, become a little bit more peaceful because we're economically interconnected? Another, I think, important point to notice is that, generally speaking, democracies very rarely go to war with each other. And generally speaking, in the history of international relations, when you have a number of powerful democracies, the democracies don't start the wars. Now that's not always true. And obviously the United States has started its fair share of wars over the last 100 years. But generally speaking, democracies are less militaristic, less than undemocratic societies. So another thing you can do if you want to see less war in the world is encourage democratization. I think I'll stop there for today. All right, everybody. It's good getting to see you, being back at our regular time, and I will look forward to seeing you all next week, I believe Thursday afternoon again. Take care. Be
Looking
sure to
forward
vote.
to it. Thank you.
Ann. Of course. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Stanley. Bye, guys. Take care.